my second presentation. Okay, good. So anyway, these paver mounts that we've been talking about, you've seen some few pictures of them. This shows the detail a little bit more. Now these are very versatile. They're not just one pony things. The large hinge mount fits over a 12-inch paving stone that can be left in a remote location during the day. You set it up the night before or some night before. John has built 6 of these to use with all 6 of my 80mm MIDI systems, and he's built 2 for the Maxis. The mounts are sturdier than any tripod I've ever used and can easily point to very high altitudes, which is always a problem with tripods. These can go right to the zenith, although if you go right to the zenith, you might want to put a rock on the base to counteract it. The other advantage, it's really not what it is an alt mount, because the mount goes up and down over this curved, circular curved screw, and then you tighten it with those 2 black wooden discs there. And then you can also move it left and right by loosening the screws at the base, and then moving the cradle that holds the telescope left and right. And that's really what it really is an altitude mount where the altitude directions are in orthogonal. But it's effectively it's an alt-az mount at low altitudes. And the other advantage of this is a protractor can be used to preset to the target altitude, and also a laser pointer can be held against the rail, which both useful for making it quicker to pre-point these things than just a tripod. Next slope. This just shows a paver mount sort of disassembled in pieces that for transport, and showing the wrench we use to tighten the screws back in and reassemble it. It doesn't take much assembly. Next, it shows the ties that hold the telescope in the rail. This shows one of the MIDI telescopes on the mount. Next slide. The high altitude. The first attempt to actually use these scopes for pre-pointing the night before was for a northern limit graze of the 5th magnitude star 48 Leonis. The path was only about 30 kilometers north of Alice Springs, and this was not too long after we had gotten into that city. We were only there for about a week. But there was only 1.5 hours of dark time, so we set up the 3 paver mounts the night before. The good profile promised multiple events in a kilometer-wide zone. Next slide. This shows the zone across this 10-mile highway, this one-lane paved highway, and if a truck comes the other way, you have to get off on the shoulder, but there are wide shoulders along the road, dirt shoulders. The Stewart Highway is a 2-lane highway, the north-south highway that goes through Alice Springs, and so this just shows the junction. We were pretty close, so we didn't have to travel very far on the Tenamai for this. Next slide. This just shows the typical countryside. We were sort of surprised at how many trees there really are in this desert area, and they're all somewhat green. I mean, the ground, the foliage on the ground is all pretty brown and showing the effects of drought and more desert conditions. But apparently they did have a wetter wet season than usual during the few months before we arrived, and so the trees whose roots go down to the water table were not in bad shape. But it provides lots of nice places where you can hide scopes. The one thing we found for this June 22nd event, we had trouble finding our equipment after we had placed it, hidden it, behind these things. But we figured out a way to, we had no trouble afterwards if we used coordinates from Occult Watcher or other sources and GPS navigation then to get to the Occult Watcher, those coordinates. And then we would find some intersecting road, but there usually wasn't one. So if there was none, we would just tape a reflective address number to the nearest road marker post. They have road marker posts about every 200 or 300 meters along these highways. But you don't know which one, but we could identify it by putting a number on them. So these posts are all just plain posts. They don't have numbers like the ones in the U.S. often do. But then we would paste distances along and perpendicular to the highway from the post to the or other landmark to where we had put the telescope. And so that way we had no trouble. Next slide. This shows all the stations we set up for 48 Leonis. We did the 3 Paver mount stations. But we really hadn't learned how careful you have to be with these things. But stations 1, 2, and 3 were the Paver mount stations, and the first one was completely successful. And station 2, which we had set up the previous night, the pre-pointing was confirmed. I went back to it to put the recorder on, and it was dark by then, and I noticed that the star field was correct for the pre-pointing. But the darn recorder failed to record, and so we didn't get any data at that station. In station 3, I noticed the pre-pointing was wrong for some reason, but there was no time to correct it. And we tried to run these other stations with the larger scopes, but we had problems with those. One was just trying to find the thing, and we ran out of time and didn't get data there. But we did set up another 80 millimeter scope on a tripod, 1A, between stations 1 and 2, and that was also successful. So at least we got 2 good recordings, and one only because of the, we would have, if this recorder had worked, if we had been more careful with the recorder to be sure it might work, we would have had at least 3 good recordings, and just gaining more experience, I know we would have been more successful for the future, but we haven't had any good grazes since then in the area. But next slide. Shows we really got a lot of good timings. We did hit the good part of the profile with stations 1 and 1A. This shows the timings. These stations were in the best part of the profile, and they show there probably was a north shift of about 100 meters of the path. So the events lasting over about a 2-minute period at both stations. Next slide. The next event, the next big asteroid event, was one where we had 2 hours of dark time. So that wasn't enough to cover this nice wide path with a 10.3 magnitude star with the asteroid Bertholda. This occurred on July 31st, which happened to be Joan's birthday. But these events, though, are, when you do these, they're quite tiring efforts. Because, well, we'll go to the next slide and we'll show our deployment tie-in. And it also shows the results. Some of the. This just shows that Richard Williamson observed it from his observatory on the south side of Alice Springs, so he was sort of the southernmost anchor at a little more than 1 sigma from the southern limit. But we had a station right at the southern 1 sigma limit, and we set up 4 Paver telescopes the night before, extending up to the center line. And Steve Kerr, we knew he had a cord from Rockhampton that was going to be between it, so we skipped that, and then we set up, we were going to run 2 more stations to the north that we would set up only on the night of the event in the short time we had to do that. And I was hoping we could even get a 3rd one maybe, but things just didn't work out as well as planned. But But anyway, it was kind of a disappointing effort. We did deploy these the 4 paver stones correctly. John Broughton gave us 3 paver stones, and we bought another one at a local hardware store, which wasn't as good as the paver stones he gave us. We found it's slightly was made of concrete and a little bit crumbly, in the test we did, the pointing wasn't quite as accurate, but it was still well within the accuracy of the 80 millimeter scopes. But anyway, what happened is, from north to south. Let's go back to the other one. Can you go back to the previous one? Yeah. The southern station was mispointed a little bit. The star did cross the field of view, but exited just a few 10 seconds before the event. Then we got a success, and the occultation was recorded at the station south of the southern limit, proving there was a south shift. The next station was mispointed. And the next station, number 4, an animal actually attacked the equipment, so there was no observation there. So that was strange. The only time I've ever had that happen. And there was no occultation at the station just inside the northern limit. And at the northernmost station, we had a problem with the telescope focus tube came out, and we couldn't get an observation. But the paver mount pre-night, the one that did work, showed where the occultation was, and it was the only one that did. So next slide. That just shows setting up one of the paver mounts on a stone. Next slide. Well, that's actually setting it up the next day. We set them up in the afternoon when we deployed, and then used the dark time at the more northern stations. This just shows from a previous talk the programmable remote that we use for timed recordings, how we place this programmable remote in the camcorder in a bag with this plastic tube at the base so that the flash, the infrared flash from the programmable remote is seen by the electronic eye of the camcorder and turns it on. So this works pretty well. This is Scotty Degenhardt's idea, and actually he gave me some of these tubes that he made from clear plastic tubes that had candies in them. So we didn't think of that. We've had these things for years, the next shows what happened at this one station number 4. Next slide. As we got to the station, and this bag was not in its upright position, it was scattered away from the telescope. And you can see how it's been ripped apart. The camera and the remote were still in the bag, but sort of they weren't pointing at each other or anything. But somehow in the commotion, the camcorder was turned on, so it just played to the end. It didn't record; it just played to the end of the tape. But you can see the rips in the bag. And whatever was got a hold of that plastic tube. There was no sign of that plastic tube. It was gone. And so what we think happened is that probably a dingo, who have their sense of smell is 1 billion times better than a human's, and so it probably smelled the sugar from the candy that had been gone for years. But it could have been a kangaroo too, but we don't know. But we just know the aftermath. Next slide. This just shows the one cord we got, and Steve Kerr also had a miss from a location not too far north of center, so he was puzzled about that, but there was just a sizable south shift for this event of about 1 sigma or so. But the whole effort was a lot of work with little gain. At least we got the one positive. But anyway, we kind of learned a lesson from that we have to be more careful with the transporting the paver mounts. When we pick them up, the scopes and the paver mounts, we put them in the back, and we really didn't secure them well enough. So we know now that's important, and we did some tests afterwards which showed that, with everything secured properly, you can always be sure that the pre-pointing will work. But we didn't have another chance for pre-pointing effort until the big Galilea event on September 30th. So let's go to the next event. The next slide. This shows the occultation of a 6.3 magnitude star. It was one of the better events that I really wanted to get. Anyway, the map shows Marla in the center of the country. That was the easiest place for us to drive south from Alice Springs to this town in the northern part of South Australia. The path also crossed Port Hedland on the west coast, but you can see there's less dark time there. And then it also went over New South Wales, where there are several observers, a few observers there, and a whole bunch of observers around Wellington. So there were actually 10 observers signed up with Occult Watcher who tried the event. It turned out we had an unfortunate weather situation. There was a patch of cloud that was predicted right over the path, over the Stewart Highway over Marla, and there are no other highways within hundreds of kilometers that intercepted the path that we could drive on. So that was what we had to deal with. But I could see this predicted patch of clouds, and so I made a plane reservation to Port Hedland. There are no discounts, so it turned out a very expensive flight for Joan and I to go there. And Joan was screaming, we can't afford it, and so forth. And the other problem is that of course, we couldn't take the paver stones. And of course, Port Hedland has a hardware store, and I hope we could buy paver stones there. They're only $5 if you're going to spend, a couple of $1,000s on plane tickets. What's another $40 or $30 to buy paver stones? But it turned out that when we would be there, it was a holiday, and the stores were all closed. So we had to take something there, and so we had this idea, Joan had the idea of using corkboard instead of paver stones. And we tested that out the night before our flight, and it was successful, but not quite as accurate. It showed that with the corkboard system, we could pre-point to about a quarter of a field of view, whereas with the paver stones, we were better than a tenth of a field of view. We did everything properly. But anyway, as the time approached for our cutoff for the flight, the small patch over the Stewart Highway and the successive predictions became smaller. And I said, it's going to either go away in the future predictions or it's going to move. And so we had 24 hours before the flight, we had to make a decision. And I said, okay, let's cancel. We won't go to Port Hedland. Spend all that money. So instead we drove down to Colgura, a roadhouse there, and we used that as a base for a couple of days while we did all the effort here, and deployed south across the path in the uncertainty zone. But anyway, though, on the subsequent forecasts, that darn patch got larger each day up to the event, and so we knew we were going to have some clouds, and it was worse in New South Wales and New Zealand, and none of those observers got anything. So it was all up to us. Next slide. This just shows the corkboard to the right here. We just nailed the corkboard into the ground with big nails. and that held them in place. And we did this. Set it up and let it sit over a day, and then put it. The next night we put the telescope back on the corkboard and checked the pre-pointing, and did the same thing for one of the Paver mounts, the Paver stones, to get a comparison. This shows the equipment. The camcorders are the bright blue lights, and the Kiwi is showing the red and yellow light. Next slide. Um, anyway, excuse me. Now this just shows the results from Occult Watcher, showing the different stations we set up, about 8 or 9 stations. But our southernmost station was our attended station, and we had a miss there at 109 kilometers south. But the only other unambiguous observation was at 20 kilometers north, where we had a miss recorded. And in that station, one of the Paver mount stations, the target star went right through the center of the field of view. It was just perfect timing and everything. So we were happy with that. It showed that this whole system works, but you have to be careful. And there was actually another night with another occultation by the asteroid Melissa, I think it was, that happened the night before while we were setting up the Paver mounts, and so that sort of distracted me a little bit, and I actually made a mistake, and I think I accidentally kicked one of the Paver stones that I pre-pointed or mispointed, and this one that was near the center line recorded the star field, which I haven't been able to identify, but I'm sure it was just that I did something stupid and didn't correct it. And the other ones, we just had a litany of equipment problems, battery failure at one station, and camcorder things not triggering right. So we have to test that equipment, but we haven't had time to do that. And then 2 other stations which we had set up were completely clouded out. As we drove north from our attended station, we could see this big bank of clouds to the north, and sure enough, it wiped out at least 3 of the stations. So this was very disappointing at this event. I really wanted to get good observations of and prove the pre-point method that we did show that at least when we did things right, things work, but you have to be really careful with everything, and you have to have clear weather too. So and you have to be careful with the recording equipment, make sure that all that works. So all we know is that there was apparently a south shift, because this station wasn't very far. The 19.8 kilometer was, but not as large as the PPMX catalog predicted. So it was very disappointing with no positives, but we learned some more lessons from it. And especially if you can afford it, go to the place where the weather is best, not just possibly good enough. So next slide. Which I think this may be the last slide, unless I have some remarks. Yeah, that's the last slide. Okay, well, thank you for your patience, for listening to me, and sorry that the weather is not so good for the asteroid occultation tonight, the Oeon event, or however you pronounce it. So I guess the IOTA meeting should have been held in Burlington, Iowa, but who would know that in advance, that the Midwest would be clear and Las Vegas would be cloudy. So anyway, hope you have some breaks there, but doesn't look too good for modal station deployments especially. So although one thing, and when it's partly cloudy, you set up remote stations, they will record the star field if it's there or not. So if you do things right, You just wait until the cloud's clear enough to pre-point the telescope, and then you go on to the next one. It slows you down, but you can still set up an array, and then if it's the luck of the draw then whether the station is clear or not at the time of the event. So, yeah, okay, yeah. Right, right. Um, anyway, um, anyway, we've really enjoyed our stay in Australia, and with the friends and people we've met there and everything, and the glorious skies in Alice Springs most of the time. So it's clear, just perfectly clear about 75% of the time, approaching 80%. Every once in a while we were really concerned with the Venus occultation because we had 2 nights in a row where it was overcast before the event, but the predictions consistently showed that it would dissipate and be clear by the event. And I had some contingency plans to drive to other places and everything, but I could see from the observations and things that things were going to be great, and they were for that event. And also, after this Galileo event, just on October 1st, the Australian Meteorology Group, the board, finally got online the new Japanese weather satellite images, which really show detailed cloud cover even at night over Australia. So we didn't really have that resource until this month, and those images are really great. So anyway, that's all I had. If there are any questions, I'll try to field them.